Hello, everyone. My name is Dinah Birch, and I'm president of the Association for Victorian Studies. And I'd like to begin by welcoming one and all to this truly special event, which marks the award of the very first book prize to be given by the British Association for Victorian Studies. This prize, which has gone, as you'll know, to Jen Manion's brilliant monograph, Female Husbands, A Trans History, was specifically for a second monograph, and there was a very strong list of contenders to choose from. It was pleasing and reassuring to see the intellectual energy and depth of research reflected in these books, and it's really cheering to have something to celebrate this evening after a difficult year. So congratulations, Jen. And I'd like to take this opportunity to draw your attention to Rachel Tukolsky's wonderful study, Picture World, Image, Aesthetics and Victorian New Media, which received a very honourable mention from our judges. I think Rachel is participating in this evening's event. We can't see you, Rachel, but we do send you too our hearty congratulations. I'd also like to take this opportunity just to thank our three judges for all the really careful work they've contributed to this prize: Charlotte Boyce, Jo Parsons, and the chair, Rowan McWilliam. Their essential contribution is really very much appreciated. Before I hand over to Rowan, who will also be chairing this afternoon's proceedings, I'd like to point you to the way in which BAVS has been responding to the pandemic. We've all hugely missed our annual get-together, our in-person conference, which was due to be held in Birmingham this summer and is now postponed until the summer of 2022. And we're very much looking forward to seeing each other face-to-face at that Birmingham event. But we have had a wonderful array of online events to sustain us, BAVS at home. And I'm really grateful to all those who've made that possible, and especially Claire Wood, who has worked so hard on our virtual programme, so hard and so successfully. She's here with us this evening. We've been keenly aware of the hardship faced by some of our members as a consequence of the pandemic. And we've been very pleased to have been able to raise funds to support the award of a number of really very much needed hardship grants. Donations to enable us to allocate further grants will be really very welcome indeed. And you'll find the link to the Just Giving page on the BAVS website. And we're currently running an auction of all sorts of tempting items, appeal for Victorianists, to raise funds for these grants. And I'd like to thank Melissa Gustin for organising this auction. It's closing on the 7th of August, so this is a very good time to see what's on offer. Just Google BAVS auction. If you don't pick up the reference, I think it's on chat. That will always take you straight through to the link. So I think that's enough from me. We're all really looking forward to hearing from Jen and from Claire Tebben here with us. Welcome, Claire, and Sarah Parker. Welcome, Sarah, in response to Jen's thoughts. And we do want to hear your questions in chat, so keep them coming. Over to you, Rowan. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dinah. Let's think about the BAVS Prize for a second monograph 2021. First of all, can I just pay tribute to my fellow judges, Dr. Joe Parsons and Dr. Charlotte Boyce, who worked extremely hard and were a real pleasure to work with. I will say, especially for anybody else who submitted work for this prize, we thought deeply about your books. We did not read a bad book. In fact, every book that we read was excellent. What we were looking for, though, for the prize and for the honourable mention, is that we were looking for books that were not just major studies, which is what we read, but we were looking for books that made the field look just a little bit different afterwards. And I think that would be true of our prize winner and the honourable mention. The field looks a little bit different. We were also looking for books that embodied the interdisciplinary mission of BAVS. And I think that's also true of both of these works, which are immensely exciting. Rachel Tukolsky's book is A Picture World is a study that really rethinks visual culture in the 19th century. And I think anybody interested in visual culture needs to have read that book. And the same is true of Professor Jen Manion's book, Female Husbands, A Trans History. First of all, can I congratulate Professor Manion, who's just been made a full professor at Amherst College, which is extremely good news. This is a book which has already, even without this prize, has had an immense impact. It's been widely reviewed, it's been widely thought about. I suspect it's already being heavily taught. And if it isn't, come September, we will be seeing this on a lot of book lists. I'm absolutely confident about that. Jen Manion is Professor of History and Sexuality, Women's and Gender Studies at Amherst College. She's also a leading LGBTQ activist and a leading anti-racism activist. And many of those values, I think, are infused into this book. Another thing that we loved about this book is there are wonderful stories in this book, but it's about much more than stories. We loved the texture of the analysis, the way that Professor Manion really takes the reader on a journey to try and interrogate the relationships that she's exploring. I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more about this. The format of the event is that Professor Manion will speak for about 15 minutes. We will then hear, first of all, responses from Dr. Claire Tebbett, who is Assistant Professor of Gender and Women's Studies at Trinity College Dublin, currently working on a monograph about medical and popular understanding of sex changeability in 1930s Britain. And then we will hear from Dr. Sarah Parker, who is lecturer in English literature at Loughborough University. And Dr. Parker is a specialist in women's poetry, in decadence and aestheticism, and is the author of, amongst other things, the monograph, The Lesbian Muse and Poetic Identity, 1889 to 1930. So first of all, though, let's hear from Professor Manion about Female Husbands, A Trans History. Professor Manion.
Oh, thank you so much for the award and for such a generous introduction and enthusiastic take on my book. I don't think there's a way to describe the feeling of someone getting a project that is your life's work and wanting to wanting to think with it and think through it and be in conversation about it. So this is just a great honor to be here in this conversation. I think I'm going to talk about the backstory a lot because that's sort of what's not available so much in the book, and it is really the story of the book. In some way. Anyway, okay, so I think one of the there are a lot of different threads that led to this project. I'm trained as an early Americanist, although with a comparative, like, women and gender focus as well. And so my first book really is a late 18th, early 19th century study of the penitentiary. And in that work, I stumbled into just a handful of cases where people had, what we would then say cross-dressed as being the dominant term used in the archive and in the scholarship, and committed some kind of crime and were incarcerated. And at some point along the way, perhaps during the trial or after they were incarcerated, were found out, to be a different sex. And so I wanted to think more of that. And I felt like it was an important story, but the archive for my first book just didn't lend itself to that. There were only 2 or 3 cases. The other thing, for those of us who work in 18th and 19th century newspapers for any amount of time, you stumble into these little anecdotes. And there's a ton of cross-dressing anecdotes in these papers. And, a lot of times they're stripped of identifying details, like, actual legal names, or sometimes they're even stripped of places where you could track people down, but they're there. And they're like a constant staple of the press. And I wanted to think more about why that was and what that meant. The other thing, I've taught, a history of sexuality in the US survey for my entire career, so since 2006. And in that course, we sort of, get to the turn of the century sexology. And there's such an important, robust body of scholarship around that period for, the UK and all of Europe and the US, right? Like, what's happening in late 19th, early 20th century around sexology. And really this moment that we look to see where gender nonconformity in people assigned female at birth and female masculinity become the defining markers of homosexuality, right? And so masculine women, people assigned female who transgender live as men, that from that moment on, and I would argue until 20 years ago, or maybe even in some ways still to the present, that female masculinity is seen as evidence of homosexuality. But before that, that was not the case, because there's often not even reference to sexuality in a lot of these records, and certainly not any idea that female masculinity or transgender gender nonconformity in people assigned female at birth was a cue or a code that they had a homosexual identity or homosexual tendencies. So that's the backstory, some of the questions that I wanted to figure out how to unpack with this story. The book as originally conceptualized was pretty broad, and I did a really broad kind of catch-all sweep to try to figure out gender nonconformity in people assigned female before sexology. And there are so many different kinds of records, and I know some people on this call work with those records, and there are so many more books that can be written from this archive. So I think first and foremost, like in some way, I'm a pretty traditional historian, that I had some questions, but I was really like waiting to see what I found in the archive and see where that led me. One of the threads, one of the paths was this recurring theme of people called female husbands. And so somewhere along the line, I decided that in order to tell a cohesive story about one group, that I would focus solely on them, and that would be the contribution of this book. And one of the reasons there are 2 reasons I did that. One is because there tends to be often a lumping together of all different kinds of expressions of gender nonconformity or transgender by historians at least, and not enough attention to try to tease them out, right? So it's like really important to me that people think of Anne Lister and the female husbands and their differences, rather than, oh, anybody in some general, you know, catch-all category being gender nonconforming or queer or lesbian or trans, is just kind of like all the same. But I really want to create tease that out and say, I'm just going to follow this one group and see what we can learn from and about this one distinct category. The other reason is because in much of the really important scholarship on similar people that I have loved my whole life in both history and literature, about people who we then would have referred to as, you know, having cross-dressed, there was a very strong persistent heteronormativity. And sometimes that was on the part of historians, and sometimes that was in the archive itself, where people who may have transgender and lived as a man for a certain period of time, and then, you know, found their true love and, you know, began presenting as women again and married a man. And female husbands are the only group, not only who don't do that, but for whom there's records, like, because they lived as men for so long, and for most of them, especially, thank you UK libraries and archivists, because like the marriage licenses are, you know, exist. And so for the UK sources, there was actually like a stronger legal record trail for me to follow than for some of the US cases. And so I thought it was also a great opportunity to tell a queer history and to figure out how transness and queerness were entangled. And I think that gets me to the question of, you know, what makes this a trans history? Why is that important? And I'll say that, you know, in chapter 3, there's a story about William Chandler. They were written about in The Female Shipwright was the publication. I read that in grad school. I love that book. I wanted to work with that. And I couldn't figure out what to do with it. I couldn't figure out what my analysis would be that other people hadn't already done. And I think back then it was Diane Dugal, her really important book about maritime ballads. So some of these stories, you know, in that genre have been with me for a long time. And it's really only with the emergence of transgender studies and the transgender community that has invented, challenged, you know, created new vocabularies, used language to help us see things more expansively, that I got the intellectual tools that I felt like I could make an original argument about these sources that would not, as my one chief critic has argued, narrowly, anachronistically, you know, impose a modern identity on these people from the past by calling them transgender. I actually don't identify anyone in that way or call them transgender. But really what transgender studies and theory and community practice does is help us open up in a really like expansive way how we think we see people living in relationship to gender. And it's really challenges us to suspend our assumptions and to suspend our judgments and try to put our own biases and norms like on hold or on the background as much as possible and just like watch them moving through the world. And that led me to use certain language in the book. So in transgender theory and practice right now, instead of saying people are boys and girls or men and women, we say, well, you're assigned something, like you're assigned a sex in the doctor's office, and sex is assigned at birth, right? So I was assigned female at birth, but that was based on, you know, what my body presented, what the doctor saw in relation to the norms in the world in which I live. But that's actually not an indicator of how I'm going to understand myself, what my relationship to gender is going to be, how I'm going to carry myself, who I'm going to interact with in what ways, and all these kind of things. That's gender, and that's separate from assigned sex. So that is, you know, one of the core philosophies of the book. The other core philosophy, which is anchored in that value, is this idea that I actually have no idea how any of the husbands would have identified or did identify. I don't have their diaries. I don't have personal letters. I just know what they did, and I know what other people thought about what they did. And so in order to avoid kind of erroneously, putting them in a box, I'm going to try to keep it open, and I am going to only use the gender neutral pronoun they in how I talk about them. And so I think those decisions in some way they're just like really specific technical writing decisions, but in another way, it's like the whole intellectual philosophy of the project. And it's what makes it read the way it does. And it's why it's a little different than other articles and books that have, interacted with or analyzed some of the people. And so I think that's kind of my offering of this, which is to say, in some ways, it's just like a very traditional archival history book. I don't say anything that the archive like doesn't support. But then because of some of these other theoretical decisions that I made in how it's written, it tells a different kind of story. And I'd love to see what people think about that and, and see what it makes you think about. So I think I'll stop there. I'd love to hear what Claire and Sarah have to say, and then everyone else as well. Thank you.
Oh, that's brilliant. Amongst other things, by the way, Jenna, one thing I loved about this book is I think it's a great study of the Atlantic world. I mean, you just said that you wanted to look at your figures moving through the world, and I think that's absolutely great. I think this is a great study, amongst other things, of migration, mobility. I found, which adds to the real texture of the analysis. Well, thank you very much. And let's move on to hear from Dr. Claire Tebbett.
Thank you. There's a lot that I could say about this book, so I'm going to try and limit myself and kind of focus on three main areas, which are this very category of female husband, the sort of idea of location and this sort of Anglophone world, this Anglo-American connection and these ideas of migration, and the idea of female wives, because I think that's a really important aspect of the book. So I think one of the really exciting aspects of the book is to actually focus on the category of female husband. You could see, I think, thinking about how some of these stories have been sort of narrated before, they almost kind of tell a story of where we are at particular moments. And I think at this moment of such heightened transphobia, to have a history, to have a book that really does give the onus to these stories and to prioritizing those kind of trans identities is really important and key. I think thinking about some of the works that have looked at them in the past, one of the things that really struck me, going back to something such as Female Tars by Suzanne J. Stark, when you look at the index, if I look up somebody like William Chandler, it will say, go to the name assigned at birth. If I go to female husbands, I have exactly the opposite experience. It's that moment of starting to think about the identities of these people and actually thinking about, kind of who they were and giving that credence. The ways in which a lot of these lives have been taken as part of the kind of feminist project that didn't really give credence to the kind of their identity as men, the ways in which there's sort of those lesbian histories. I think Federman and Donahue sort of talk about a lot of people covered in very particular ways and talk about female husbands as very much a lesbian identity. One of the real strengths and interests I found here is the way in which you've managed to kind of bring together gender and sexuality and sex in a way that isn't trying to kind of delineate them, that manages to kind of allow for those ambiguities, that allows for the ways in which they kind of are slippery categories and they do sort of intersect. And there's something really powerful, I think, about thinking about this category of female husband. And as you say, not actually sort of saying, you know, these people are transgender in the way that we might now understand it. I think there's something yeah, really sort of strong and powerful about that, and thinking about what that category meant. Thinking as well about this kind of idea of location, sort of Rowan just sort of alluded to that slightly. The fact that you have, and when I was first presented with it, I was sort of thinking UK and US, you know, kind of, wow, that's a lot. But when you look at these stories and you see these linkages, I think there's really something quite striking in that. One of the things that would interest me a lot is how much of this is kind of about the Anglophone press. We have stories of people such as Lobdell, who is kind of moving from one location to another. I wonder if this is sort of picked up in the Anglophone press more broadly, if, you know, kind of, for example, there's sort of Australian connections, or, you know, kind of how far that extends, or whether there's something very particular about these very particular kind of sort of imperial centres, because the attention to very particular forms of empire and whiteness is really striking, and something that isn't, I think, seen anything like as often as it might be in sort of histories. I mean, Riley C. Snorton's book would be a sort of, you know, obvious exception to that, but it's really kind of striking how whiteness and sort of traces of empire really kind of come through in this. One of the other things that really struck me is this sort of terminology of female wives, and this idea of actually focusing on the wives and, you know, kind of their agency, their parts in these narratives, the ways in which, you know, kind of they're so often portrayed as being dupes, or as being somehow very much secondary to the stories. And I think actually kind of elevating them and bringing them sort of back into the narrative is a really important element of this. And it has that kind of classic issue that there's far less about them, because they're not the ones who have these exposés. They don't have these gotcha moments of sort of female husbands in the way that they do. So I think that for me is a really kind of powerful aspect of the book, and actually kind of thinking about the wives, and very quickly kind of touching on the sort of idea of, and slightly not quite tongue-in-cheek, not quite provocatively, it's not really provocative, but kind of thinking about some of the terminology and the use of they, and kind of almost saying, can we say about any of these characters what their gender is? You know, kind of, can we not say, you know, the female wives also, you know, could they not be afforded they as well, if the female husbands are afforded they? You know, kind of, how do we think about, because I think there's something very interesting in thinking about the category of female husband and ascribing they to the female husbands, when kind of my instinct is with some of the, and this may just be me, but with some of the people described, I'm kind of thinking, this is someone who, you know, really kind of presented himself, and I've kind of given myself away there and kind of, you know, said, you know, I'm a man. But I can see the sense of describing the category in terms of they. But then, you know, do we extend that? Do we think about the female wives in terms of they as well? Yeah, so let me end there, and that's my condensed thoughts. Thank you.
Oh, you're on mute, Rowan.
Yeah, thank you very much. And let's move on to Sarah Parker.
Thanks, Rowan, and thanks to Jen and Claire for those fascinating thoughts. Claire did that very naturally, and I've written my thoughts down to try and keep them into 10 minutes, so it won't be quite as flowing as that. So when planning this celebratory event, I'm sorry to say that I was worried about potential disruption. And as I'm sure you're all aware, the terms trans, lesbian, queer, gender, sex and sexuality, and the connection between them are intensely contentious today. And it's a sad reality of our present moment that some seek to dissever or draw firm boundaries between identities associated with sexual orientation, such as lesbianism, and issues of gender identity and gender expression. And the battle over the precise meaning of bodies and desires doesn't just characterize our present moment, of course, but extends back to the past too. And historical scholarship can be particularly ripe fruit for such debates, I guess fruit that people are fighting over, as historical subjects cannot, of course, speak for themselves or define their own identities or desires in the way that living individuals can. So in reconstructing the lives of gender non-conforming individuals, we must therefore be careful not to project our own frameworks, including the skirmishes and hang-ups of the present moment, onto the distinct and often enigmatic conditions of the past. At the same time, we must avoid overlooking the potential desires and queer subjectivities of past historical actors. So in Female Husbands, I'm glad to say, Jen manages to triumphantly avoid these potential pitfalls, telling the stories of gender non-conforming individuals with admirable sensitivity and nuance, bringing these individuals and their relationships to dynamic life while continuing to respect their difference by ultimately acknowledging the truths that we simply cannot know about them. So Jen's book shows that it is absolutely possible to examine the past without falling into those familiar traps that I described. And in doing so, Jen's book provides a model for future historical scholarship. And I don't just mean works that deal in queer historiographies, but historical studies more broadly. For all history is engaged ultimately in telling the stories of those who are long dead, different from ourselves, and who can no longer speak for themselves. So Jen's model of open-minded, careful scholarship that respects the dismiss of the past while acknowledging its personal and political efficacy for the present should, I think, inform a wide range of future historical studies, not just those dedicated to issues of gender and sexuality. But I want to get a little bit personal for a moment, since the personal is political. I was particularly pleased and indeed surprised to be asked to speak at this event for two interconnected reasons, which I think give me a particular perspective on Jen's book. Firstly, as you've heard, I'm primarily a literary scholar rather than a historian, and as such I was of course absolutely blown away and totally intimidated by the formidable depth and breadth of Jen's historical. Appreciated equally about the book is its depth of feeling and empathy for the figures discussed, even when, and perhaps especially when, it is impossible for us to fully know or determine how they truly felt. There's a thread of humanity running through this book, a warm pulse that would be lacking if it was entirely concerned only with the facts, figures, and chronological events as dictated from an exterior standpoint. And this empathy requires a degree of imagination on the part of the historian, balanced, of course, with the crucial qualities of rigor and objectivity. I think the emotions present in the book are its strength rather than a weakness to the historical scholarship on display. Jen never loses sight that these are human beings being discussed, however unknowable they may be to us. And in this sense, the book reminds us that we don't need to fully understand individuals in order to empathise with them. This imaginative empathy links to my second viewpoint as a reader. As a cis woman who is fairly feminine in appearance, yes, I did put on lipstick for this event, as we were discussing earlier, I'm used to my queerness being overlooked. Until that is, people learn that I wrote a book called The Lesbian Muse, or they see me with my rather masculine partner, who is usually called Sir by mistake. In fact, reading Jen's book, I could easily imagine that if we were magically transported back to the 19th century, my partner might well be my female husband. For this perhaps rather selfish reason, I, like Claire, massively appreciated Jen's attention to the female wives who remain, as they acknowledge in their book, such shadowy figures that they are seldom even granted complete names in the press. Jen not only rescues the identities of these women through their extensive research, they also consider them as, quote, legitimate subjects of a queer past, with agency and desires of their own. Jen contemplates the possibility that these marriages were not merely the result of deception or convenience, but of active choice, For example, that female wives such as Abigail Allen may have chosen James Allen due to their difference rather than in spite of it. I found this attention to the female wife's desire, a desire that encompasses and embraces rather than overlooks their partner's transness, particularly refreshing. In recounting these courtships and marriages, Jen hints at the particular qualities, courage, resourcefulness, dare one say pluck, that made and still makes people who transgender rather sexy, at least in my view. Did certain women actively seek out female husbands? What might a female husband have offered to their wife that a cisgendered male husband was unable to? What made these relationships a risk worth taking? These questions remain tantalizingly open for further exploration in future scholarship. But to conclude for now, and hopefully I think we've got lots to discuss, although the majority of the narratives in Female Husbands end in suffering, punishment and estrangement, several aspects of the book also offer inspiration and pleasure for contemporary readers, not least the joy of recognising one's queer ancestors. And these stories, for all their unfathomable difference, resonate with many of us living and desiring in the present moment. And for this, we must thank Jen again.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you. Two great contributions there from Claire, from Sarah. I'm going to call on Jen to respond, and then I hope our panelists will have a bit of a discussion. Can I encourage people watching to put questions and comments into the chat function, and in time I'll draw on some of those comments and put them to the panel as a whole. But Jen, would you like to just respond? Because I think there was some really interesting comments. We'd love to hear your response.
I mean, thank you. Just, you know, having like really smart people, again, just like being in conversation with these ideas, it's such a treat. I wish I got to talk to two of you while I was writing the book, actually, because a lot of the things that you raised were questions that I grappled with and lost sleep over, and, you know, we're all part of the process. I think, you know, just the small point about the index, like I did the index myself because of that. I just thought this is going to be a total train wreck. You know what I mean? Like I put so much care into like using people's chosen names, and, you know, and if I turn this over to someone who doesn't have the same investments in the project. So the index was also political. For me, you know, the question of whiteness and, you know, whether this is a story of empire or the Anglo-American press, I think it's, you know, yes and both. Like there were definitely, you know, references to cases in the Australian press. I noticed a little bit, and there are some important cases also from Australia and New Zealand in this era, and a little bit of scholarship on them as well. And so I think both arguments could probably be effectively made, that it's an Anglo-American press story that could include those records, and that the press in Australia and New Zealand handled them the same way. And yet it is also this really intense like focus on whiteness, you know, whiteness and like working class. Like it's definitely like a British working class story. And that's another thing that, you know, I loved about it. It's so fascinating, and it ends up getting transported into the US press. So there's never the same kind of elevation and celebration of the working class in the US in the same way. But these female husbands end up holding that space, right? Even in the US, even later in time. And some of them, you know, did come directly from England and Scotland, and some of them were born in the US. So that is like a really important part of the story. And I think my anxiety in trying to decide how to go forward with this is, you know, what does it mean in this moment of racial reckoning and long overdue need for attention to anti-racist scholarship, that I'm gonna put out a book that's mostly about white people. And I think part of how I made the decision to say, okay, this is still a book that can and should be published at this time, is there's so little trans history. And that even if most of the archive is about white transness, that's important for us to understand and grapple with, that is part of the story of understanding race and racism, is why certain categories of existence were, restricted to white people. And that is, and so I think, if I'm curious, especially for Claire, because I know this hits your work of a later era, and maybe I'll jumble two questions together at once, is if that same parameter holds, for the people that you're looking at or not. And I guess, what is the connection and bridge between the early female husbands of the earlier era and the people you work with who live very similar lives, but may not necessarily be presented, within that category?
Yeah, thank you. I think there's something very striking about the kind of primacy of whiteness and the ways in which discussions are very racialized. And I work on a lot of kind of 1930s stories, and I'm particularly interested in the category of man-woman, which you kind of, the book sort of points to as well as being one of these categories that has become kind of redundant, but did have a meaning and doesn't kind of map onto any of our current categories. And the ways in which the man-woman becomes kind of turns into quite a medicalized category, and that medical discourse kind of following on from sexology, which I guess kind of comes back to some of what you're saying about how you're looking at almost kind of gender nonconformity before sexology, and that primacy, that importance of sexology. The ways in which the moment you start talking about the medicalization, you're talking about you're talking about eugenics, you're talking about sort of very racist ideas. And so certainly, I think almost without exception, the people I'm looking at in the 1930s are white, but there is this real kind of issue of them being considered in ways that are very racialized, and their bodies being considered. And I think there's a real issue in terms of what you're saying about kind of differences. It's partly moving into that kind of medical discourse, it's partly thinking more about the body. And I think one of the really interesting things about your book about female husbands is this idea of kind of true sex becoming an issue, and this kind of idea of how sex and gender just didn't function in these same ways in the period in which you're looking at. So lost my train of thought. Yeah, there's this real kind of almost this sort of almost silence around whiteness. You have this kind of idea of particular standards of the body and how kind of ideas of sex and binary sex in particular are mapped onto that. There's a really powerful phrase that you'd got in your book about just kind of how white supremacy is being embedded into the gender binary that really struck me, that you can have these sort of silences, but there is this real kind of upholding of it in particular ways that the sort of categories are being discussed and formed, that I think really strikes me. And I think you can also see in some of the discussion that comes through into the 1930s.
Thank you. I'm really excited about your work. I'm happy I got to learn more about it a couple months ago, I think, when we were on that panel together. I don't know. I mean, I guess I have thoughts for Sarah. We could just keep going around, see how we do. You know, I was struck by your focusing on empathy and emotion in the text. So, and I think, you know, that's something. Anyway, I just think about disciplinary differences and if that's something more embedded in your tradition or not, but also that there's the investment in, or the acceptance of opacity as an approach to understanding and grappling with the boundaries between, you know, sex, gender, and sexuality that is comes out of literature and literary studies and Valerie Traub's work and queer historicism, and to what extent is that informing like your engagement with my book? Is that a productive, like exciting space? And like, what could we historians like benefit more from, I think, that from some of these like, you know, analytical tools that are more squarely coming from literary studies.
And I'll just, So I'll just put in, Alison Orams just posted an interesting point about the chat in the chat function about this. The press stories that she wrote about for the 1930s were strikingly often about race and national belonging, which speaks to Claire's point. Many were about North African examples, others French. So a lens through which racial mixing, class and UK relationships to the continental empire were explored and condemned. Some of these were fictional. She also wants to say how much she's enjoying the discussion. so let's keep this going. Sorry, Sarah, I interrupted you.
That's okay, Rowan. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is kind of about disciplines learning from each other. I certainly think English literature has a lot to learn from history still. I suppose one of the things relating to what you were saying, Jen, is I suppose in literary studies we're quite used to attending to the gaps and silences within fictional texts, and I suppose being open to evidence, but also perhaps the idea of unknowability, uncertainty, and I'm not usually spending my time extensively concentrating on fully historical monographs, if I'm completely honest. And when I looked at this book, I could kind of see that. I thought, yeah, this is as you I think yourself said, in some ways conventional historical scholarship. And yet, what I really appreciated was your refusal to pin these figures down. And to align them on one side or the other of these debates, and to present them. I suppose one of the things about it that strikes me as a primarily literary scholar is that, of course, in a way, this is about telling stories, isn't it? And they're narratives that you are reconstructing, and yet doing so in such a way that to avoid projecting a certain take on it, while also allowing their humanity to remain and to touch us. I suppose that's what I meant, that I think that's a huge feat for it to be such a moving book without being one that involves a kind of a historical imaginative projection onto these figures. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful. Well, it's so funny because I think I did have I had an ulterior motive. Maybe we all have this, but of course I wanted like people in the present to learn from the past. And so my personal, experience, I think maybe I empathize with the subjects because I relate to them, on some level so much, because I feel like I lived through this moment in the late 90s and the early 2000s where I had experienced some young trans students saying, well, you can't be trans, you're not trans, because I wasn't legible to them as trans in the way that they learned about it and the way that they define themselves. And then, I also experienced, being with, butch lesbians saying, terrible things about trans people. Like, they're not like us, they're different. And I was like, everybody, what the fuck? Like, I am all of these things and we are all in this together, like seriously the same. And so I think from my own like subjective location in interacting with attempts at policing and categorizing myself, I just like, I'm not like so naive to say that I didn't understand it, but I just thought like, this is not going to help anyone or anything that we care about in terms of like queer liberation or gender liberation, number one. And number two, why is everyone so confident they understand what the lines are and how they should be policed. Like, where did that confidence like come from? And I think, and for us, it's like, in this case, I think it is our strength, right? As historians and literary scholars, it's like, we're trying to unpack and understand layers and complexities rather than like, shh, shh, shh. But we're definitely like in a moment of this, right? Not unlike, you know, the invention of sexology, that era. It was like another moment of that. I don't know, what do you think about that comparison between then and now?
I don't know, Claire, if you want to go first on that, or?
I think I'm going to sort of slightly circumvent the question and say, I don't know about kind of sexology or sort of, I think these moments of categorization, these moments of trying to find the boundaries and trying to kind of sort of say definitively, you know, kind of, yes, this is butch lesbian, this is trans man, this is, you know, kind of lesbian, this is feminist hero, and these are clearly, you know, kind of completely separate and discrete categories. You know, kind of, I think there's something really striking about a category like female husband that seems to be a category that almost describes, when it's been written about, almost describes the moment in which it's been written. And one of the things that I think is really, I like about this is that you're kind of not doing that you're really kind of saying, although, you know, kind of perhaps with hindsight we'll be saying, you know, kind of course it's of its moment, but it's saying we can't say these, you know, these aren't commensurate. We can't say that this is this category, or that, you know, kind of courtesy of sexology, we can clearly now see that so-and-so is actually, you know, kind of very clearly level something invert with, you know, kind of something rising. You know, that's not how it is. So I think that kind of drive to categorize, I think there is something of that at the moment. I think there is perhaps a bit of a tendency to try and ascribe it. And I think sometimes it's that very careful line of this kind of, you know, we've always been here, of trying to sort of allow for the fact that there have always been gender non-conforming people, without saying they've necessarily always been people who fit into the same categories as there are in the present. And that really kind of difficult balancing act, because it's so open to kind of attack and misinterpretation. Yeah, that's my attempt at that. I'm gonna pass over to Sarah, see if you can have a better go.
Oh, I don't think I can have a better go, but yeah, I'm just kind of nodding away, just agreeing with both of you. And I think, yeah, that I really like that idea of, you know, there's that sense of, oh, well, you know, don't project the present identities onto the past. But from what you say, Jen, it's not that, it's actually realizing through your own experience of how present categories don't fit, that being really useful as a historian to then think, well, if that's the case, you know, right now, and people aren't even listening to what I'm articulating or seeing, you know, recognizing what's in front of them, then how wrong do we have potential to be about the past, or how wrong have we been? Yeah, I mean, I think the desire to categorize, I guess it does seem like I suppose I think that desire is quite a consistent one, but right now the battle over the categories seems to be worse than ever. But I think one of the ways that you combat this really well in the book is through the very, very particular choice of language that you spoke about. And I guess something I wanted to ask you was, I guess, about the response to the book and the reviews. And I've noticed that the pronoun choices get picked up quite a lot. So I didn't know if you had any thoughts about that, because I absolutely understand why you did that, and I think it was the only solution to describing the situations that you're dealing with. But I just wondered if you had any thoughts about people's response.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to answer your question, and also Claire brought this up, like at some point, a lot of the people just seem like men, right? So why don't I call them he? And I that could have worked, maybe it's but then it would raise I was just like invested in a much bigger project than just any one person's gender. And I think the pronoun question in the present, like, between individuals is like really important. It's like really important that people respect people's pronouns. Like that's just really, really basic, but that's not all, right? So it's like, I do feel like it's important for us to reserve like the right and the space to problematize the role of pronouns in our life. And everyone's life and in historical writing. And it's just like this one more space of excessive gendering, right? Like why does referring to someone in the third person have to invoke like a gendered process and a gendering process? And even if in real life we're being true to that person, and if they change pronouns, we change pronouns, and we're kind of going along with that, which is like one path, which I think is also fine. I think another path is like, why do we have to have so much gender? Like, why do we have to be gendered subjects in order to exist as human, to be in a relationship, and to be referred to in the third person, And so, I know some people, who critiqued it. I think maybe Grace Laverly, who is the person I respect the most, who critiqued it as a practice. I'm like, sure, I get it. Yeah, and I totally stand by it. Like, I think what I did is the right thing. And I think I helped create continuity over the course of one's life for a person. Like this idea that like, that someone comes out and they change their name, and they change their pronouns, and suddenly they're a totally different person. I mean, for some people that is true. And for other people, they're like, I've been this person all along. And so I was trying, or maybe I became this person at a different moment than when it became evident to all of you. So I was trying to avoid this, like, and I know the moment, like when this person, began, having a trans subjectivity. Like, who am I to know that? And who are you to think that you know it? Like none of us can talk to them. So I felt like that for that reason, my investment in I stand by. And I also wanted to put, if let's say female husbands who lived pretty trans looking lives, right, in community and on a spectrum with the soldiers and sailors, who I still think, somebody I wish would write another book about. Like, I love the soldiers and sailors. It's so cool. There's so much there, like, and they're not necessarily queer subjects, in that we don't have evidence that they married queer wives in the same way, but I don't think they moved through the world very differently. I think people thought the same things about them. I think the same structures of war and empire and labor and class, like, made their lives possible. And people are trying to understand the boundaries of sexual difference. It's the same, it's the same. Well, it's actually very different in the records, but it's the same questions. And so I was trying to not. I was trying to hold on to this idea that everybody should be engaged through a trans potential, like framework, and not just, but also then, sorry, I'm just jumping all over the place because Claire said, why didn't you use they for the wives? I definitely thought about that. We debated that in my household with my queer wife for like 2 weeks, I think. And then we just decided no, because it's already so confusing to read the book if you haven't read like much work with like they. And if everybody's a they, if they're both theys, like it's going to be really hard to, know who I'm talking to. And I already leaned very heavily on last names, instead of, pronouns. And so, but some people like it, but other people like it, right? The point is, it makes us think about the work that gendered language does in setting the parameters and really in most cases narrowing the parameters for how we understand a life. And I don't think that has served any of us working in any field. Like, I think gender as a category of analysis has gotten really flat in terms of how we're operationalizing it. So I was hoping to like disrupt that.
Great. We've had a question in the chat box. Forgive me, I can't see the name of the person who's asked it, but let me. It's a question directed to Jen. Jen, your work focuses on the 18th and 19th centuries. Would you want to argue that the kind of relationships that you describe and the responses to them were also common in earlier periods, that they were not exclusively a product of relatively recent cultural circumstances? So how much of this is the product of particularly of the 18th and early 19th century, would you say, or the 18th and 19th centuries?
Could say that again, as opposed to like 16th and 17th?
Yeah, I guess so. I think that's probably, and I can't speak for the questioner, but would you see the similar patterns earlier, do you think? How do we historicize?
I mean, I think there's some new work on that right now that I haven't read yet, so I'm afraid to even say anything. But I do want to say, I guess, just also coming back to, you know, I mentioned Diane Dugal before, and this whole, that there, I think it's an 18th century thing. I think there's like this, and I think one of the threads is this rise. It's partly like inspired by some like, you know, consciousness around women's rights or feminism, right? Wherever there's then a book about all these important women who've ever lived, and lots of biographies, and like female everything, female Marine, female sailor, female pirate, female lawyer, female parliamentarian, female this, female that. So there's definitely this like, you know, late 18th century feminism that's happening, that's like focusing on women and putting like women, you know, so there's like, so it produces this whole body of literature, right? And whether we think of those people assigned female or transgender, or women who did things that men were supposed to do, in some cases both, that's definitely like a late 18th century thing that happens. And so I think there is a body of, you know, narratives and pamphlets, and, you know, that comes out of that moment.
Brilliant. And we've got a question, I think, from Dinah. Could you say a little more about what you meant by scholarship on histories were getting a bit flat? I'm intrigued to know more about what you meant by this, and what was it that you wanted to disrupt?
I think, you know, I'm like trained as a women and gender historian, and, you know, think our field is like, you know, the most important field that's really exciting. But maybe like for the first decade, like it was coming inspired by Judith Butler and Joan Scott, and that whole like moment, it was like really exciting, like how we were going to rewrite the whole thing.
Right.
And I feel like we settled for like gender as a qualification. So it's like gender is qualified by race, gender is qualified. It's like race, class, you know what I mean? The human experience is like qualified by these like other categories, but we're not like completely like tearing it all apart. You know, like most of the, you know, books, again, it's my first book. So it's like, I am, you know, in this like camp of people who at some point, you know, thought, you know, that we were doing, I was going to be a part of a much more radical upending of separating sex from gender, or, you know, showing how how gender is a social construct, and that somehow a lot of that stuff is just evolves into like women being about women, which is something I also did. So I'm naming myself here. I'm not pointing the finger, you know, or that race and class shape how, you know, a woman's experience, or shape how gender functions in someone's life, but that we are letting the fundamental category of sexual difference remain stable as scholars. And it's really hard to not do that. And the only way I feel like I was able to do it to some extent with this book was because I picked a very specific archive, right? In which like you couldn't deny that these subjects totally blew this whole thing up. And so because they blew it up, like, okay, now how can we work with this? So I think it's also just a problem of like archives and records and what we have access to and how they're framed. It's not like just our fault.
In fact, I should say that last question was from Helen Rogers. Sorry, at the moment I can't see who's actually asking a question. I can't see any more questions at the moment coming up, but could I go back to a point that Claire made, and just which I thought, I don't want to see get lost, which I thought was a very interesting one, that and perhaps Claire, you might want to say something more about this, but it's one about female wives, you know, and their agency. You talked a bit about that, and in fact you said, you know, perhaps should they have been called they. I think that's what you said, and I thought that was a very interesting point. I was wondering whether Jen might want to respond to that.
I'll talk about it a little bit, and I also actually want to hear what Sarah thinks about this, because I, you know, and I wonder, I definitely, you know, I started another project or something that was going to become something about the queer wives after the book. I don't even think I called them queer wives in the book. I think I called them female wives, and then we're like, they're queer, we should call them queer wives. So again, it's just trying to figure out, when can we take a leap in terms of language and conceptualization, that these are queer. Queer is a more capacious, I think, right? We know it's an analytic, it's not just an identity, and it's a little more forgiving than lesbian. Lesbian wouldn't work anyway if they were in relationship with men, but like, there is like a queer history of these wives to be further unpacked and written. So Sarah, how should we do it?
I'm just like yay to that. Yeah, no, I love when you use the term queer wives earlier. I immediately wrote it down. I was like, queer wives, yes. I mean, I can see what Claire's saying about the pronoun thing, but I can also understand your earlier response that could lead to a thicket of theys that would be almost impossible to journey through. But I think if you could or were willing to do a similar book that was highlighting I suppose the different dynamics, right, within these relationships, because I should think for some of these queer wives, I would imagine, were fully embracing of she, her feminine identity, seeing themselves very much as conventional wives with, you know, kind of masculine male husbands. But I should think that, as you found with your various female husband figures, this probably actually varies from partnership to partnership, from time to time. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the queer wives were themselves engaging in gender non-normative behaviours and self-fashionings, and perhaps understanding their marriages very far from man and wife, and perhaps you know, perhaps different kind of comradely bonds. So yeah, all I'd say is I'm here for it. I'll definitely quit the Queer Wives, the sequel. Would be brilliant if you feel you've got another book, you know, in you.
I think it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because the female husband, as you sort of say, Jen, is very much this kind of category that is put on people, rather than being a kind of you know, a sort of chosen label or sort of form of self-identification. Whereas for those who are married to the female husbands, there's not, you know, kind of, is that even a category, or are we just kind of ascribing them? Are we just sort of, you know, kind of artificially saying, here are a group of people? Queer wives seems in some ways kind of like, there's something about female wives that really exposes some of the sort of what's at work with the idea of female husbands, you know, kind of that when you sort of put that word female in front of wives, you know, you sort of start to see some of what's going on with female husbands as well. And I think there's something really nice about that. But there's something about kind of queer wives that's perhaps, you know, I can see, Sarah, why that might be, you know, sort of this appealing thing. But I think there's something quite interesting about the fact that they are this kind of almost supplement. They are this sort of, you know, they're not the sort of they're not the category that's being identified. They are something that kind of comes up as a result of this category. And yeah, kind of quite what you do with that, I think, is really interesting, because I think, yeah.
It's so complicated because, you know, it's just like misogyny keeps them buried and hidden. So one instinct is to elevate, unpack, embrace. And yet, yeah, like since we usually have no idea, you know, like what was actually going on for them, how not to distort, you know, how, you know, so. Yeah, but the other thing is like, I don't even know if it is really possible, because it's very, you know, because the female husbands had male legal identities, you can track them in the records like more, like there's more of a paper trail than for the wives.
We've got a question in the chat function. Did any of the press stories refer to two men being married, in other words, male wives? If there was a comparison, how differently were they seen? This is Alison Oram, actually, I think, coming in. Yeah, I think that's for Jen. Did any of the press stories refer to two men being married? Is there a concept of the male wife?
No. I mean, just simply, there's like literally one article that was reprinted 3 times or 5 times, or it was like one of those things that circulated. I think it was from China. It was just a different thing, you know, like it's not a phrase. I mean, you know, now we all play around with these databases, right? And, you know, doing combinations of gendered terminology is so fun. Like when you're just like in a digital newspaper database, I do it all the time. When I'm watching TV, and it's just, that's not a thing, you know, and that's interesting too. It's like, you know, and I think, yeah, so I'll leave it at that. Go ahead.
This has been a very, very high quality discussion. Just in case there's any more comments, but I was just wondering if just any comments from the panel. I said that I thought one of the reasons why I think this has won this prize reservedly is that I think the field looks just a little bit different, you know, in the light of this book. And I was just wondering, you know, in a sense, I'm going to ask you just where next. You know, how do we write histories, well, of anything but history of sexuality, histories of identity, differently in the light of female husbands? Do you have a sense of where we might go, or indeed, does anyone listening in have any contributions to make on that? Because I'm always keen to, you know, to think about, well, where does the field go next? Not just Victorian studies, but really anything. You know, where do we go next? What are the kind of perspectives that we want to develop, say, over the next 10 years? How will this feed into our scholarship? Does anyone have any thoughts?
That's some big questions, Rowan.
Yeah,
I think we're all a bit, all a bit scared. Well, I mean, I think it definitely achieves, as you say, Rowan, changing the field and dare I say, kind of transing the field to borrow Jen's use of trans as a verb. And I'm just thinking in my own areas. I mean, I work on Michael Field, the poets that were. I'm going to say 2 women writing as a man, but something that's developing very interestingly in that, Michael Field's scholarship is actually, you know, really deeply thinking about kind of, queering and transing Michael Field, and not just talking about this kind of sense of true female lesbian identity hiding behind the pseudonym. There's wonderful work being done on figures like Vernon Lee, for example, and the idea that perhaps we should be using they for Vernon Lee when discussing their gender identity. So certainly in my own little micro field of late 19th century writing, there's a lot of, you know, even in the last year or so, some really some more radical thinking, as Jen was calling for, around gender.
Okay.
I think the kind of call to activism, which Rowan, you kind of mentioned at the beginning, that I think informs Jen's work. I think, kind of Jen sort of is really, you know, kind of informing it, and sort of ideas of kind of that sort of run through it, I think is really important, that these are really big ideas that have that kind of contemporary resonance and importance, and thinking through those, and, you know, kind of working on that, I think is, you know, going to be really important when there is so much, you know, racism, sexism, misogyny, transphobia, you know, all the rest of it, sort of being attentive to that and thinking through it. I think this sort of idea of thinking about categories in the past and thinking through how they can be thought about. And also I think there's really something in the idea of how ideas are traveling. Something that really struck me is this idea of a category sort of having this sort of transatlantic sort of journey, and how, you know, kind of we think about identity in categories, whether that's something that, you know, kind of how we think around these ideas. Identity politics is such a, you know, kind of has been so much at the fore of queer histories, but starting to think about that in slightly new ways in terms of these categories and the ways they travel, and class as well. I think sort of the way that sort of come into the discussion as well, the way that sort of class plays into a lot of these choices, those kind of material aspects of what was open to people, what wasn't. So yeah, I think those are going to be really key things in terms of where we go.
And Jen, so we're transing the field, as Sarah put it. I mean, you know, yeah, where next with this kind of analysis, do you think?
I mean, I think Sarah and Claire kind of touched on some things that I would say. I think, you know, partly we're in this moment where we think that sexual and gender identities come from inside of us, that they're like, there's like this pure interior thing that we then vocalize. And I think, I hope what one of the things that the work showed is that, like, even if that's a piece of our experiences, that it's still all a social construct. And so, like, kind of where we are in the world and our own race and class and religion and, you know, location and you know, that all of these other things just kind of shape how we would then describe ourselves and what we think of as possible, and that we approach the past with that kind of contingency. Yeah. And then I think the other thing is, you know, right now we think part of modern life, and, you know, especially, you know, people my age and older think, oh my God, now people have sex changes. Like when I was a kid, you know, you just were a boy or a girl, or, you know what I mean? That it was like, you know, we didn't even talk about any of this, right? That there was like a simpler, more fixed time. And I think what my book shows is like, no, actually, that it's never been like that, you know? So first of all, people have always changed their sex, you know, and secondly, everybody else who was reading the newspaper knew about it and was thinking about it. Like it's, you know, I think for me, like, you know, I come from a small mining town in Pennsylvania. And when I found in, you know, it was like it was called the Pottsville Miner or something. And the newspaper had just begun, it was like the region had just been populated and the mine was dug. And literally there's a story, I think that it was Henry Stoke. I think they actually ran two over the Times, but it's like, they're reporting on Henry Stoke from Manchester, England, in this little rural mining town in Pennsylvania. And so everyone who's like there working in the mines, you can imagine they're, I don't know, on a break at the bar afterwards, and somebody's reading the paper, because we know newspapers were part of print culture, right? And they're reading the story and people are like, oh, well, how did he do that? Oh, well, what did other people think? And so it's like, they're literally thinking about, well, how is sexual difference made? And how does somebody change it? And how do some of us like not even know that someone did this? Holy shit, like this is everywhere. Anybody can do this. Like that is like, that's the constant, like for me, that comes out of, you know, so this idea that like, oh, in the past, you know, so that's, I hope people carry that kind of awareness when they approach and they try to write about gender and men and women, you know, in the 19th century. Thinking that your subjects were a part of those conversations and communities.
It really strikes me hearing you say that, that these stories are circulating. People had, you know, kind of this sort of Pennsylvania mining sort of town had these stories. I sort of in the early 2000s in Manchester, I remember somebody telling me about this hidden lesbian history that nobody had heard about, that was Henry Stokes, and kind of thinking, you know, is this really a lesbian history? But also kind of, you know, that sort of fact that this was something that was known, that was, you know, kind of reaching around the world, if we sort of see, you know, Anglo-American is around the world, you know, is, you know, the whole world, you know, kind of had that reach, and yet we have this sense of it within the last 20 years or so as being this completely forgotten hidden history that needs to be, you know, kind of that nobody knew about, and gets framed in very particular ways at particular times. And as you say, it was, yeah, it was just there to read about. Right across the Anglo-American world.
Okay, I'm not seeing any more comments on the moment, although Dinah just said that she agrees with Claire's point about social class, and we are thinking about the complexities of identity and contingencies of identity. And actually, I did want to ask that question about, you know, where do we go? Because I think that's one of the things that I think this prize needs to do, to think about the kinds of scholarship now we're going to build in the 2020s, and I think that's very exciting. You know, transing the field. I'm going to steal Sarah's point that you know, I think that's maybe what we'll spend some time thinking about, and shaping the shaping new kinds of interpretations. So I think I shall. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to your point, because I guess when I think of transing the field, I just want to say that it's not about uplifting transgender people, although that's a part of it, sure, I'm glad for that. But it's really about exposing, right, the way gender norms are constructed and challenged and fail and fortified for all of us. Like, that's the promise and the hope of like transing the field and transgender studies. It's like, it's the next, I see it as just like building on, you know, feminist theory, you know, from the 80s and 90s. That was really transformative and eye-opening for me. And I see a lot of, you know, the work coming out of trans studies is just like, okay, what's the next thing? Like, what do we need to help us like really problematize this again and really get at the contingency instead of getting stuck in some things being natural? Like, that's what happens. Gender gets naturalized so easily. So transing the field is a part of helping all of us see the contingency of gender and, you know, and race, because race and gender are contingent together, for everybody.
Yeah. Okay, and in fact, I'm delighted this conversation has been recorded, because apart from that, it's been very high quality and very forward-looking. So I hope people who are watching this on the recording actually will actually find a lot to actually go and think about. I think we'll bring it to an end. Can I particularly thank Claire Wood, who has sort of made this all happen. We've got some nice comments coming in from people saying that Dinah saying how thought-provoking the discussion was. Thank you, everybody. Congratulations to Jen. So yes, let's leave it at that. Thank you. Well, thank you, Jen. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Sarah. But thank you, Jen, for this wonderful book, which also I need to say is now out in paperback. Cambridge University Press has been sensible enough to put this almost straight into paperback at an affordable price. Okay, so if anyone who's watching this has not gone out and bought this book, you have no excuse. Okay, so yes, so buy this book and teach this book and think with this book and discuss this book. Okay, so a really worthy winner for the first ever BAVS Prize for a second monograph. So thank you, everybody. What a great evening. What a great discussion. Thank you, and goodbye, and thanks to all.